Monorails are a slick, cool and futuristic mode of transportation, but we don't seem to have many of them running around. In fact, when compared to conventional rail, monorails are almost non-existent. And so, why is that? Well, monorails actually tie into this contemporary agitation that all our problems will be solved by tech bros and their magic high-tech solutions. Behind bullshit projects such as the Hyperloop or the Boring Company Loop, monorails are next in line. And so why is that? Why are monorails such a bad idea, despite there being relatively successful systems operating today? Alright, so problem number one of basically any monorail system is cross-compatibility. Meaning that if you build a monorail line, only monorail trains will be able to run on it, which in practice limits your system to a very specific passenger train set. And so this here is a photosphere image of the Otsuka station in Tokyo. You can see the passenger platform and the two tracks adjacent to it, but next to it there's another pair of tracks. Now, during my stay in Tokyo, I used to take the Narita line from this station. In the morning, I would often see freight trains going past the station on that adjacent pair of tracks. Now, if this was a purely monorail system, this of course would not be possible. But then you could say, oh, well, that's easy. Let's just build a monorail and then leave next to it two pairs of conventional rail tracks so that both freight trains and monorail trains can run. But that idea doesn't really work either. The third and the fourth tracks are used to divert trains to should there be a problem with the first or the second. You know, if the train breaks down or something, or if a switch goes out, then trains can go around the station. You know, of course, if you had two monorail tracks and two conventional rail tracks, you're kinda stuck with those two. You cannot divert any of the trains to any other tracks. Whereas with a fully conventional rail system, you could just switch them over. Speaking of which, problem number two, switches. Now, this might seem like a banal thing at first, but monorail switches are one of the most awkward and contrived things you can build in transportation. If that thing gets stuck during switching or there's any other malfunction, the entire monorail line would need to be shut down for hours possibly, so that the repair team can actually get out there and somehow reach the malfunctioned switch, which would most likely include industrial alpinist stunts. Now, in contrast, if a conventional rail switch goes out, it's much easier to reach and the problem is usually resolved within 1 hour. And if it's an older construction, you can either send Mike out to hammer it back into place so that the next train can pass, and then just fix it properly later. Passing a monorail switch is also excruciatingly slow, whereas in Europe there are conventional rail switches certified for 200 km per hour. And that is not the speed for going straight through it, that's the speed at which the actual switching between the tracks happens. And so problem number 3 of monorails is that they have to be completely elevated. And so if we look at these schematics comparing conventional rail to bottom-supported monorail to suspended monorail, we can see that monorail tracks, regardless of where they are, require a significant amount of track infrastructure, namely that they have to be elevated even on the surface and underground. And this poses a rather serious problem. You see, surface-level rail infrastructure is the cheapest of the three, and so when we build rail lines, we try to build as much as possible on the surface. But with monorail, these cost savings are impossible, because as you can see, both on the surface and underground, you have to build infrastructure as if you were building elevated rail, with some corresponding construction costs, of course. So this means that over long distances, where you would lead the rails on the ground, monorail is just not viable. So if you wanted to build a monorail line, you would need to find a section where only elevated rails are possible, which in most cities is extremely rare. After all, the vast majority of public transit rail lines go either partially underground or on the ground. But even if there was a section in your city where only elevated lines were possible, you still have to deal with problem number 4, maintenance. Now, monorail maintenance itself is not particularly costly. However, as we discussed, there are very few places where it makes actual sense to build a monorail. So if you have a transport company that has, say, 10 light rail lines, and they want to build a new line between the city center and the airport, and a fully elevated line would make actual sense on that section, it still makes very little sense to build a monorail line. Because if you already have a pre-existing light rail system, you should probably build a line where you can run rolling stock you already have, otherwise you would need to invest in an entire new maintenance depot, in specific repair equipment, retraining personnel to maintain the monorail trains, all this extra effort and money just for one single line. And this is of course something that no sensible company would do. Moving on, the 5th biggest problem with monorails seems to be capacity. Now, it is entirely possible to build a monorail system capable of transporting a lot of people. However, the previously mentioned problems relegate the monorail to very specific locations. And because of this, the monorail cannot really operate at high capacities as mass transit should. And so let's take the Sydney monorail as an example. It operated between 1988 and 2013, carrying 70 million passengers during this time. The system had 6 trains running between 8 stations on a 3.6-kilometer long line. Now, 70 million passengers over the course of 26 years sounds like a lot. And this also happens to be the number of passengers that the Budapest M3 metro line carries in 5 months. And it can do that by having 6 times more trains, 2 times more stations, and a line which is about 5 times longer. And this produces a 70 times difference between ridership numbers. And all of this in a city which is less than third of Sydney's size. Now, the M3 line has a ridership similar to the Line 3 of the Chongqing Rail Transit, which is supposed to be the busiest monorail line in the world, and the Chongqing Line 3 monorail can achieve these numbers by being 4 times longer and having more than twice as many stations. Now, of course, this is not meant to be a direct comparison. There are other factors in play, such as how the city is laid out, where the line is led, and so on. But I wanted to show you how disproportionately low the monorail's capacity is compared to conventional rail. As in, you have to build out a ton of infrastructure even in a Chinese metropolis to surpass the passenger count of a metro line in a 1.7 million European city. So to recap, the 5 main problems of monorails are cross-compatibility, switches, the need for the track to be completely elevated, the need for costly parallel maintenance infrastructure, and low capacity compared to heavy rail or even light rail. So why do some cities build monorails? Well, mostly because they are considered to be sleek and futuristic, even though you could achieve similar passenger numbers on a proposed line by just running 24 of those little rubber-wheeled sightseeing trains. Actually, if you had a line where you ran 12 of those things, and each carried at least 50 people per hour for 12 hours per day, you would produce the same annual ridership numbers as the Sydney monorail. Monorails in general seem to be a version of this tech bro future transit grift, which produces overpriced, overhyped, and yet very low capacity transit, which are, at the end of the day, for the few and not for the many. Go figure. And that's the reason why monorails are a bad idea. Alright, so this was my hot take on monorails. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you feel like this content is worth your money, then there is a Patreon link down in the description. Your patronage is very much appreciated. In the meantime, I'll be seeing you when I'll see you.